The heavy doors of Buckingham Palace closed with a soft thud as the last of the New Year's Eve guests departed into the London night. Charles Windsor, King of the United Kingdom and 14 other Commonwealth realms, stood in the Grand Hall watching the final car disappear through the palace gates. The official celebration was over, but, for him, the real ceremony was just beginning. Lady Margaret Thornfield, the King's most trusted private secretary, approached with measured steps across the marble floor. She had served 3 monarchs in her 40-year career, and tonight marked her final New Year's Eve in royal service. Her retirement would take effect at dawn, but, first, she had one last duty to perform, a duty that only 5 people in the world knew about. "Your Majesty," she said softly, her voice echoing in the now empty hall. "It is time." Charles nodded, his weathered hands clasping behind his back. At 75, he had participated in this ritual 53 times as Prince of Wales, always observing from the shadows. Tonight would be his 3rd time leading it as king, but the weight of responsibility felt heavier than ever before. They walked together through corridors lined with portraits of his ancestors. Queen Victoria's stern gaze seemed to follow them, as did the painted eyes of George III, Henry VIII, and Elizabeth I. Each face held secrets, Charles knew. Each had participated in variations of what he was about to do. "Lady Margaret," Charles said as they reached the private elevator that would take them to the rooms above the throne room. "Are you certain about retirement? The new secretary will need years to understand the complexities of what we do here." Margaret smiled, a rare expression on her typically stoic features. "Your Majesty, I have served the crown faithfully, but some traditions require fresh eyes. Miss Catherine Morrison has been preparing for this responsibility for 3 years. She understands the gravity of what tonight represents." The elevator rose silently through floors that most palace staff never accessed. These were the private chambers where monarchs retreated when the weight of the crown became too much to bear in public. Charles's great-grandmother, Queen Mary, had spent countless hours here during World War I, writing letters to soldiers' families and praying for strength to lead a nation through its darkest period. As they reached the 7th floor, Charles could see through a window the Thames glittering in the moonlight. London spread out before them like a tapestry of lights, 12 million souls sleeping or celebrating, unaware that their king was about to engage in a ritual that had shaped British history for centuries. "The box is prepared?" Charles asked. "Yes, Your Majesty. It arrived from the Tower of London at sunset, as tradition requires. The Keeper of the Royal Mysteries personally delivered it." Charles paused. The Keeper of the Royal Mysteries was a title that appeared on no public record, held no official recognition, and yet wielded more influence over royal decisions than most government ministers. The current keeper, Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, was a historian who had spent 30 years studying documents that the public believed were lost or never existed. They entered a small chamber that served as an anteroom to the throne room. Here, on a simple wooden table that had once belonged to King Alfred the Great, sat the silver box that would dominate the next hour of Charles's life. The box was unremarkable in appearance, roughly the size of a shoebox, made of tarnished silver with intricate Celtic knotwork carved into its surface. No jewels adorned it, no gold leaf enhanced its beauty. To an untrained eye, it might be mistaken for an old jewelry box or perhaps a container for important documents. But Charles knew better. This box had been present at the coronation of every British monarch since William the Conqueror. It had survived the Great Fire of London, hidden in a church crypt. It had been smuggled out of the country during the English Civil War when Oliver Cromwell sought to destroy all symbols of royal authority. It had returned with Charles II and had witnessed the restoration of the monarchy. "The contents?" Charles asked, though he knew the answer. "Unchanged since your father's time, Your Majesty. The 3 items remain as they have for 900 years. Charles lifted the box, surprised as always by its weight. The contents couldn't account for the heaviness. This was the weight of history, of responsibility, of secrets that had shaped the destiny of nations. Lady Margaret checked her pocket watch. 11:37, Your Majesty. The throne room awaits." They walked through a hidden passage that connected the private chambers to the throne room. This passage had been built by George IV, who understood that sometimes a monarch needed to move through his own palace without being observed, even by loyal staff. The throne room appeared different in the dim lighting. During the day, it was a place of ceremony and grandeur, where foreign ambassadors presented their credentials and where investitures honored citizens for their service to the crown. At night, with only a few candles providing illumination, it felt ancient, mystical, connected to something far older than the Victorian palace that housed it. Charles walked to the throne and set the silver box on a small table that had been placed beside it. This table, too, had significance. It was made from wood taken from HMS Victory, Nelson's flagship at Trafalgar, and had been used for this ceremony since 1806. At 11:42, Dr. Eleanor Blackwood emerged from the shadows. Charles had not heard her enter, but that was her way. The keeper of the royal mysteries moved like smoke, appearing when needed, invisible when not. "Your Majesty," she said with a deep curtsy that belonged to another century. "The hour approaches." Eleanor Blackwood was a woman of perhaps 60, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see through time itself. She wore a simple black dress with no ornamentation save a silver pendant that bore the same Celtic knotwork as the box. She was, Charles knew, one of the most powerful people in Britain, yet her name appeared in no newspaper, her voice was heard on no broadcast, her opinions influenced no visible policy. "The preparations in Scotland?" Charles asked. "Complete, Your Majesty. The keeper at Holyrood House awaits your signal. The fires are prepared on the ancient sites." Charles nodded. What happened here in London was only one part of a ceremony that stretched across the kingdom. At this very moment, similar preparations were being made in Edinburgh, Cardiff, and Belfast. The ritual that bound the United Kingdom together was about to begin. And the other monarchs? King Harold of Norway has completed his ceremony. Queen Margrethe's successor in Denmark begins in 1 hour. The constitutional monarchs of Europe maintain the old agreements, Your Majesty. The bonds that have prevented major European wars for 77 years remain strong. Charles felt the familiar chill that accompanied this reminder. What he was about to do was not merely a British tradition, it was part of a network of commitments and promises that stretched across Europe, binding royal houses in agreements that their peoples knew nothing about. At 11:45, Lady Margaret approached with a sealed envelope. "Your Majesty, the final intelligence reports from MI6 and MI5. Charles broke the seal and read quickly. Nothing in the reports would change what happened tonight, but knowledge of potential threats was part of his responsibility. The monarchy had survived assassination attempts, revolution, and 2 world wars partly because it always knew what was coming. Sir David Richards requests a private audience tomorrow, Margaret added. Sir David was the chief of the defense staff, and his New Year requests were never social calls. Granted, Charles said, still reading the intelligence summary. And Admiral Foster? HMS Astute remains positioned as discussed, Your Majesty. Should tonight's ceremony require naval coordination, all preparations are complete. Charles set down the reports. Even in an age of satellites and digital communications, some things required the physical presence of British naval power. The traditions he was about to observe had maritime components that stretched back to when Britannia truly ruled the waves. At 11:47, exactly 13 minutes before midnight, Charles lifted the silver box and held it in both hands. The weight seemed to double as the clock moved toward the appointed hour. "Dr. Blackwood, you may begin," he said formally. Eleanor stepped forward and began to speak in a language that was not quite Latin, not quite Old English, but something far older. The words had been passed down orally for generations, never written, never recorded. They were promises made by the first Christian kings of England, renewed by every monarch since, binding each to responsibilities that went far beyond what any constitution or parliament could understand. As she spoke, Charles felt the familiar transformation that came with this moment. He was no longer simply Charles Windsor, a man with opinions and preferences and personal concerns. He became the vessel through which centuries of royal authority flowed, the living connection between past and future, the guardian of secrets that shaped the world his subjects would wake up to tomorrow. The great clock of Westminster, audible even through the palace walls, began to chime midnight. As the first note rang out, Charles opened the silver box and looked upon items that would change everything if the world knew they existed. Inside the box lay 3 objects, a piece of parchment yellow with age, a small vial containing what appeared to be ordinary water, and a ring that bore no resemblance to any piece of jewelry in the official crown collection. These were the true crown jewels of Britain, hidden in plain sight for nearly 1,000 years. As the clock continued to chime, Charles reached for the parchment, knowing that what he read next would determine not just the year ahead, but potentially the fate of the monarchy itself. The words written on this ancient document had guided his predecessors through the Black Death, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the Industrial Revolution, 2 world wars, and the transformation of the British Empire into the Commonwealth. Tonight, they would guide him through challenges that even his remarkable mother, Elizabeth II, had never imagined facing. The final chime of midnight echoed through the throne room as Charles began to read words that had been hidden from history for 9 centuries, words that revealed the true source of royal authority and the real reason why the British monarchy had survived when so many others had fallen. The parchment felt impossibly fragile in Charles's hands as he began to read the ancient text. Written in a mixture of Latin and Norman French, the document bore the seal of William the Conqueror and the signatures of every English and British monarch since 1066. But, as Charles read the opening lines, he realized this was not merely a historical artifact, it was a living contract that bound him to obligations his subjects could never imagine. The document was known only as the Covenant of the Crown, and its contents had shaped British policy for nearly 1,000 years without appearing in any official government record. What Charles read by candlelight in the throne room explained why Britain had emerged victorious from conflicts that should have destroyed it, why the Commonwealth had evolved rather than collapsed, and why certain foreign policy decisions that seemed inexplicable to historians had actually followed an ancient logic. "Dr. Blackwood," Charles said softly, not looking up from the parchment. "The situation in Eastern Europe, our response aligns with Section 7? Eleanor nodded gravely. "Yes, Your Majesty. The provisions regarding alliance obligations in times of territorial expansion by hostile powers. Your government's decisions, while made through normal democratic processes, have unknowingly followed the Covenant's requirements." This was the paradox that had fascinated Charles since childhood. The Covenant operated like a shadow constitution, influencing British policy without the knowledge of Parliament, the Prime Minister, or even most members of the royal family. Only the reigning monarch, the keeper of the royal mysteries, and a handful of others knew of its existence. Charles continued reading, his eyes moving across clauses that detailed Britain's secret obligations to protect certain bloodlines across Europe, to maintain specific naval routes, and to preserve ancient sites whose importance went far beyond their obvious historical value. Section 12 made him pause. It outlined the monarchy's responsibility for what the document called the Northern Mysteries, agreements with Scandinavian royal houses that dated back to the Viking Age. "The Norwegian situation," Charles murmured. "King Harold's message last week about the archaeological discoveries in Bergen, that wasn't a courtesy call, was it?" "No, Your Majesty," Eleanor replied. "The excavation has uncovered evidence of the original treaty signed between Alfred the Great and Eric Bloodaxe in 954 AD. The implications for modern North Sea oil rights are considerable, but, more importantly, the discovery could reveal the existence of the Covenant itself if not properly managed." Charles set down the parchment and reached for the small vial. The liquid inside appeared to be simple water, clear and unremarkable. But this water had been collected from a spring in Glastonbury on the same day that Harold Godwin's son fell at Hastings, making it nearly 1,000 years old. According to the Covenant, every British monarch was required to drink from this vial during the New Year ceremony, symbolically connecting them to every ruler who had come before. The ritual seemed medieval, almost primitive in an age of scientific rationality. Yet Charles knew that this simple act had preceded every major triumph in British history. His father had drunk from this vial on New Year's Eve 1952, shortly before Elizabeth II's coronation year. Elizabeth herself had participated in this ceremony for 70 years, and, during her reign, Britain had transformed from a war-exhausted imperial power into a modern constitutional monarchy that commanded respect far beyond its military or economic strength. "The water's provenance has been verified by carbon dating?" Charles asked, though he knew the answer. "Multiple times, Your Majesty." The University of Oxford's independent analysis in 1975 confirmed the date and source. Professor Whitmore's sealed report remains in the Royal Archives, classified at the highest level. Charles lifted the vial and drank. The water tasted of nothing, yet he felt a familiar sensation, a connection to something vast and ancient, as if the wisdom and experience of 50 previous monarchs were flowing into his consciousness. He had experienced this feeling twice before as king, but it never ceased to amaze him. The third item in the box was the most mysterious, a simple gold ring set with a stone that appeared to be black obsidian. Unlike the elaborate rings in the crown jewels, this one bore no engraving, no royal insignia, no obvious symbols of power. Yet Charles knew it was the most important piece of jewelry in the kingdom. Known as the Ring of Binding, it had been forged by Saxon metalsmiths for King Athelstan in 925 AD and had been worn by every English monarch during their most crucial decisions. Elizabeth I had worn it when she addressed her troops at Tilbury before the Spanish Armada. George VI had worn it during his broadcasts to the nation during World War II. Elizabeth II had worn it during the Suez Crisis, the Falklands War, and the difficult years following Diana's death. Charles slipped the ring onto his finger and immediately felt its weight, not the physical weight of gold and stone, but the emotional weight of responsibility that came with it. According to the covenant, wearing the ring of binding connected the monarch to the collective memory of the crown, allowing access to wisdom and knowledge that transcended individual experience. As the ring settled onto his finger, Charles found himself remembering events he had never witnessed. He saw Elizabeth I pacing in her private chambers, agonizing over whether to execute Mary Queen of Scots. He felt George V's anguish as he made the decision to deny asylum to his cousin Tsar Nicholas II, knowing it meant death for the Russian imperial family. He experienced his own mother's terror during the early days of the COVID pandemic, when she had to balance public health with the survival of institutions that had endured for centuries. "Your Majesty," Lady Margaret said quietly. "The other ceremonies?" Charles nodded, understanding. What happened in London was only the beginning. Across the United Kingdom, similar rituals were being performed in secret locations that had been sanctified for this purpose centuries earlier. At Edinburgh Castle, the keeper of the Scottish mysteries was placing ancient stones on a hidden altar in the depths of the castle, stones that had been present at the coronation of Robert the Bruce. In Cardiff, the Welsh keeper was lighting fires on mountains that had been sacred to Celtic druids long before Christianity reached Britain. In Belfast, the Irish keeper was reading from manuscripts that predated the Norman invasion, maintaining connections to traditions that transcended the political divisions that had scarred Ireland for centuries. "Initiate the network," Charles commanded. Eleanor removed a device from her robes that looked like a modern mobile phone but was actually something far more sophisticated. Developed by GCHQ in cooperation with the royal household, it provided secure communication between the various keepers during the New Year ceremony. "Edinburgh reports ready," Eleanor said after a moment. "Cardiff confirms preparation complete. Belfast is standing by." Charles stood and walked to a window that overlooked the palace gardens. In the distance, he could see the lights of London stretching to the horizon. 12 million people slept or celebrated in the city, completely unaware that their futures were being shaped by ceremonies their ancestors would have recognized as ancient magic. "Dr. Blackwood," Charles said, still looking out at the city. "The intelligence reports mention unusual activity around Stonehenge tonight. Unauthorized gatherings." Eleanor's expression grew concerned. "Yes, Your Majesty. A group calling themselves the New Druids has been attempting to perform their own New Year rituals at the Stone Circle. They have no knowledge of the true significance of what they're doing, but their actions could interfere with the energy flows that connect the ancient sites." This was a problem that had emerged in recent decades. As interest in paganism and ancient traditions had grown among the British public, amateur groups had begun attempting to revive what they believed were prehistoric rituals. Most of these efforts were harmless fantasy, but some accidentally touched upon genuine power sources that they couldn't understand or control. "The Wiltshire police have been instructed to disperse the gathering," Eleanor continued. "They believe they're simply preventing trespassing on a historic monument." Charles nodded, but he was thinking about larger implications. The growing public interest in ancient traditions suggested that people sensed something was missing from modern life, something that the visible symbols of monarchy and democracy couldn't provide. The secret ceremonies he was participating in tonight had once been public festivals where entire communities participated in rituals that connected them to the land, the seasons, and the continuity of their civilization. "Perhaps," Charles said thoughtfully, "it's time to consider revelation rather than concealment." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Lady Margaret and Dr. Blackwood exchanged glances that carried the weight of history. No monarch had seriously proposed revealing the covenant since George III, and his suggestion had contributed to the madness that nearly cost Britain its American colonies. "Your Majesty," Eleanor said carefully, "the consequences of revelation would be unpredictable." Charles turned back to face them. "The consequences of continued secrecy may be worse. We live in an age of information. Everything eventually comes to light. Better to control the revelation than to have it forced upon us." He walked back to the throne and sat down, the ring of binding pulsing with warmth on his finger. Through the ring's influence, he could sense the thoughts and concerns of his predecessors. Victoria worried about the empire's stability. George V feared the rise of socialism. Elizabeth II had grappled with decolonization and the changing role of monarchy in a democratic age. But Charles faced a unique challenge, governing a kingdom where ancient traditions operated alongside modern democracy, where secret ceremonies influenced public policy, and where the survival of the monarchy might depend on its ability to adapt to an age of transparency. The young people, Charles continued, Prince William's children and their generation, they'll grow up in a world where secrets are almost impossible to maintain. How do we prepare them for responsibilities they can't understand until they're thrust into them? This was the question that kept Charles awake at night. Prince George would one day sit in this very throne, participating in ceremonies that seemed to belong to another world entirely. How could a child raised on social media and digital connectivity understand the weight of traditions that predated the printing press? Your Majesty, Lady Margaret said softly, perhaps the answer lies not in abandoning the traditions, but in helping the public understand why they matter. Eleanor nodded slowly. The Covenant has protected Britain through wars, plagues, economic collapse, and social revolution. Its power lies not in its secrecy, but in its continuity. If the people understood that their stability and prosperity had deeper roots than parliamentary democracy alone. Charles stood and began to pace, the ring of binding growing warmer with each step. Through its influence, he could feel the presence of ancient powers that had shaped British history, not supernatural forces, but the accumulated wisdom and commitment of generations who had understood that civilization required more than laws and institutions to survive. The ceremony was far from over, but already Charles could sense that this New Year's Eve would mark a turning point. The decisions made in the next few hours would echo through history, determining whether the monarchy would continue as a guardian of ancient secrets or evolve into something unprecedented, a royal house that combined modern transparency with ancient wisdom. As Big Ben chimed 12:30, Charles made a decision that would change the British monarchy forever. Charles turned from the window and faced Lady Margaret and Dr. Blackwood with a resolve that seemed to emanate from the ring of binding itself. The decision crystallizing in his mind felt both revolutionary and inevitable, as if centuries of royal wisdom were converging on this single moment. I want to bring Prince William into the full ceremony tonight, Charles announced. Not as an observer, but as a participant. The silence that followed was profound. Lady Margaret's face went pale, while Dr. Blackwood's eyes widened with something approaching alarm. In nearly 1,000 years of the Covenant's existence, only reigning monarchs had participated in the complete New Year ceremony. Heirs had been gradually introduced to various elements, but never to the full ritual while another monarch still lived. Your Majesty, Eleanor said carefully, the Covenant specifically prohibits. The Covenant was written for a different world, Charles interrupted. A world where monarchs died younger, where the heir's education could take decades, where secrets could be kept through isolation and limited communication. We no longer live in that world. He walked to an ancient cabinet that stood beside the throne, one that had belonged to Henry VIII and bore scars from the dissolution of the monasteries. Inside were documents that even Dr. Blackwood, despite her vast knowledge, had never seen. Charles removed a leather portfolio tied with cords that had not been disturbed in 60 years. My mother left instructions, Charles continued, opening the portfolio. Private letters written during her final months, when she knew her reign was ending. She had concerns about the traditional transition process. Lady Margaret stepped forward. Your Majesty, Queen Elizabeth never mentioned, because she couldn't, even to you, Charles said, reading from Elizabeth II's handwriting. But she could leave guidance for her successor. Listen to this, the world moves faster now than when I became queen. The challenges facing Britain require monarchs who understand both the ancient foundations and the modern realities. The gap between observing these traditions and bearing their full responsibility has become too wide. Charles looked up from the letter. She recommends what she calls graduated sovereignty, bringing heirs into full participation years before succession, allowing them to grow into the role rather than being shocked into it. Dr. Blackwood shook her head slowly. Your Majesty, the risks are enormous. The Covenant exists across multiple monarchies. Changing the British approach could destabilize agreements that have maintained European peace for decades. King Harold of Norway, Queen Margrethe's successor in Denmark, the constitutional monarchs of Belgium, Sweden, the Netherlands, they all operate under the same basic principles. Then, we consult them, Charles said. Tonight. Before we proceed. He moved to the secure communication device and began entering codes that would connect him directly to his royal counterparts across Europe. The network that linked these monarchies was invisible to their governments, their peoples, and even their own families, but it was more reliable than any diplomatic channel. Within minutes, secure connections were established. On the small screen, Charles could see King Harold of Norway, still wearing his ceremonial robes from his own New Year ritual. Queen Margrethe's son Frederick appeared from Copenhagen, where he had recently completed his first ceremony as monarch. King Philippe of Belgium joined from Brussels, followed by King Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands and King Carl XVI Gustav of Sweden. These 6 men represented kingdoms that, on the surface, seemed to have little in common beyond their constitutional monarchies. But they were bound by agreements that stretched back to the Congress of Vienna in 1815, agreements that had evolved from even older treaties and understandings that predated modern nations entirely. "Gentlemen," Charles began, speaking in English since it had become the common language of their secret communications, "I am proposing a modification to the succession protocols that have guided our families for centuries." The discussion that followed was unlike any diplomatic negotiation in modern history. These monarchs spoke not as heads of state representing national interests, but as guardians of traditions that transcended borders. They debated questions that would have seemed absurd to their prime ministers and presidents: the metaphysical implications of shared sovereignty, the energy flows that connected ancient sites across Europe, the delicate balance between earthly power and spiritual responsibility. King Harold, the eldest and most experienced, expressed the deepest concerns. "Charles, my friend, the Norwegian ceremonies tonight reveal troubling signs. The aurora borealis appeared unusually far south, and our traditional divination methods suggest major changes ahead. This may not be the time for experimentation." Frederick of Denmark disagreed. "Perhaps the signs indicate that change is necessary. Our people sense that something is missing from modern life. The rise of populist movements across Europe suggests that purely rational governance is insufficient. Maybe it's time to reconnect our nations with their deeper roots." Charles felt the ring of binding pulse with warmth as the debate continued. Through its influence, he could sense that his fellow monarchs were grappling with the same questions that had prompted his decision. How could ancient wisdom remain relevant in the digital age? How could monarchies justify their existence if they couldn't offer something that elected governments couldn't provide? "There's another factor," Charles said, interrupting the debate. "Our intelligence services have detected unusual patterns in global communications tonight. Artificial intelligence systems around the world are showing increased activity, almost as if they're responding to something we can't detect." This revelation changed the tenor of the conversation immediately. The monarch's secret traditions had always operated on the assumption that human consciousness was unique, that the wisdom passed down through their bloodlines connected them to forces that pure rationality couldn't access. The emergence of artificial intelligence posed a fundamental challenge to these beliefs. Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands leaned forward on the screen. "Our technical advisors have reported similar observations. AI systems are processing vast amounts of data related to historical patterns, ancient languages, archaeological discoveries. It's as if the machines are trying to understand the same mysteries that our traditions have preserved." Charles felt a chill that had nothing to do with the January night. The possibility that artificial intelligence might decode the secrets that monarchies had guarded for centuries had never been seriously considered. But if AI systems could analyze patterns across vast databases, correlating historical events with hidden influences, they might uncover the existence of the Covenant and similar agreements. "Which brings us back to revelation versus concealment," Charles said. "If our secrets will inevitably be discovered, shouldn't we control how they're revealed?" Philippe of Belgium nodded thoughtfully. "There's wisdom in that approach. The conspiracy theories that already surround our institutions are often more damaging than the truth would be. People imagine we're hiding evidence of incompetence or corruption. They can't conceive that we might be preserving something valuable." The debate continued for nearly an hour, with arguments flowing back and forth across the secure network. Finally, Carl XVI Gustav of Sweden, who had spoken little during the discussion, offered a perspective that surprised everyone. "My friends," he said, "perhaps we're approaching this backwards. Instead of asking whether to reveal our traditions, we should ask whether those traditions still serve their original purpose." Charles paused, feeling the weight of the ring of binding as Gustav continued. "These ceremonies, these covenants, these ancient obligations, they were created to ensure the stability and prosperity of our peoples. If maintaining them in secret no longer achieves that goal, then we're preserving the form while abandoning the substance." This insight resonated deeply with Charles. The ring of binding seemed to pulse with approval, and he could sense the accumulated wisdom of his predecessors agreeing with Gustav's observation. The monarchies of Europe had survived for centuries not because they were unchanging, but because they had adapted while preserving what was essential. "Then, we're agreed," Charles said finally. We proceed with graduated sovereignty, but we do it together. A coordinated evolution of our traditions rather than an abandonment of them. The other monarchs nodded one by one, each understanding that they were witnessing a historic moment. The network that had operated in secret for centuries would begin to operate in the light, revealing itself gradually to peoples who had forgotten that some forms of wisdom couldn't be codified in constitutions or captured in algorithms. As the connections closed and the screens went dark, Charles turned back to Lady Margaret and Dr. Blackwood. Both women looked stunned by what they had witnessed. "Your Majesty," Eleanor said slowly, "you realize you've just fundamentally altered the course of European monarchy?" Charles smiled, feeling more confident than he had since his coronation. "I've started the process. But the real changes will come when Prince William arrives." As if summoned by his words, there was a soft knock at the door of the throne room. Lady Margaret moved to answer it, and Prince William entered, still wearing the formal evening clothes he had worn to the public New Year's Eve celebration. Behind him came Princess Catherine, her presence unexpected but somehow appropriate. "Father," William said, his voice carrying both curiosity and concern. "You sent for me?" The message said it was urgent. Charles looked at his son and daughter-in-law, seeing them as if for the first time. William at 41 was only a few years younger than Charles had been when Elizabeth II began gradually revealing the monarchy's hidden responsibilities. But Catherine's presence added a new dimension to the situation. She was the first future queen consort to be brought into these secrets at such an early stage. "Yes," Charles said, gesturing toward the silver box that still lay open on the table beside the throne. "It's time for you to understand what it truly means to be King of Britain." William stepped forward, his eyes moving from the ancient parchment to the empty vial to the ring of binding on his father's finger. Catherine remained near the door, but Charles could see her taking in every detail, her intelligence and intuition processing information that would have overwhelmed most people. "The items in this box," Charles continued, "represent obligations that go back nearly 1,000 years. Tonight, for the first time in the history of our family, I'm going to share those obligations with you while I still bear them myself." William's expression shifted from curiosity to something approaching awe as Charles began to explain the true nature of the British monarchy. But, even as he spoke, Charles was aware that they were being watched not by human observers, but by intelligence systems around the world that were beginning to recognize patterns in global communications that had been invisible just hours before. The age of royal secrets was ending, but Charles was determined that the age of royal wisdom would continue in a new form. As Charles began to explain the covenant to William and Catherine, the throne room seemed to transform around them. The candlelight flickered against portraits of monarchs who had guarded these same secrets, and the very air felt heavy with the weight of revelation. William listened with growing amazement as his father detailed obligations that had shaped British history while remaining completely hidden from public knowledge. "The naval positioning off the coast of Norway," William said slowly, his understanding beginning to dawn. "The seemingly random deployment patterns that never quite made strategic sense, they were following the Covenant's requirements?" "Exactly," Charles replied. "For centuries, our Admiralty has received what they believe are royal preferences for certain routes and positions. They attribute them to tradition or the monarch's personal interest in maritime affairs. In reality, they're fulfilling obligations that date back to Viking-era treaties." Catherine stepped forward, her journalist's instincts clearly engaged. "Your Majesty, if I may, the economic policies that seem to favor certain Commonwealth nations over purely economic logic, the aid patterns that don't quite match public justifications, how much of British foreign policy is actually driven by these hidden agreements?" Charles exchanged glances with Dr. Blackwood, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "More than you might imagine, but less than conspiracy theorists would claim. The Covenant provides a framework, but it operates through influence rather than direct control. Prime ministers make decisions they believe are based on political calculation, economic analysis, or strategic necessity. They don't realize they're also following patterns established centuries ago." He moved to a section of the wall where a hidden panel concealed maps that were updated regularly but never seen by the public. These charts showed not political boundaries or military positions, but energy flows and connection points that linked sacred sites across Britain and Europe. The stone circles, the ancient cathedrals, the sites where monasteries were built, they're not randomly distributed, Charles explained, pointing to patterns that became obvious once highlighted. They form a network that our ancestors understood intuitively but that we're only now beginning to map scientifically. William studied the maps with the analytical mind that had served him well in his military career. The flight paths over Stonehenge that are restricted for archaeological preservation, they're actually protecting something else? The electromagnetic patterns that emanate from these sites can interfere with modern navigation systems, Dr. Blackwood explained. But, more importantly, they seem to have effects on human consciousness that we don't fully understand. The ceremonies we perform tonight help maintain the balance of these forces. Catherine was examining the ancient parchment with fascination. This document, it's not just a treaty, is it? It's more like a constitution for powers that operate beyond normal government. Precisely, Charles said, impressed by her insight. Parliament governs the visible nation, the one that appears in textbooks and news broadcasts. The covenant governs the deeper currents that actually determine whether that visible nation thrives or declines. As if to demonstrate this point, Lady Margaret approached with a secure tablet showing real-time data from various monitoring stations across Britain. Your Majesty, the ceremonies in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland have reached their crescendo. The electromagnetic readings are showing the expected harmonization patterns. William looked at the data with growing amazement. These readings, they're showing coordinated changes across hundreds of miles simultaneously. How is that possible? Charles felt the ring of binding pulse with warmth as he prepared to share the most profound secret of all. Because consciousness and geography are connected in ways that modern science is only beginning to understand. The ceremonies we perform don't just honor tradition, they actually influence the spiritual and psychological health of the nation. He gestured toward another set of readings on Lady Margaret's tablet. These show crime rates, hospital admissions, domestic violence reports, even traffic accidents across Britain tonight. Watch what happens as the ceremonies reach completion. The numbers were indeed changing, showing measurable improvements across multiple indicators of social health. William and Catherine watched in stunned silence as statistics that should have been random or driven by obvious factors like weather and calendar effects instead showed clear patterns that correlated with the timing of the royal ceremonies. It's not magic, Charles explained, anticipating their questions. It's something deeper, a recognition that human societies are connected to their environments in ways that go beyond the material. The traditions we maintain create psychological and spiritual anchors that help people feel connected to something larger than themselves. Dr. Blackwood added, modern research in quantum physics and consciousness studies is beginning to provide theoretical frameworks for these effects. But, our ancestors understood the practical applications centuries before anyone could explain the mechanisms. Catherine was studying the maps again, her intelligence clearly racing to process the implications. The tourism patterns around royal residences, the way certain areas of Britain seem to have lower crime rates and higher life satisfaction, it's not just economic impact from the monarchy, is it? No, Charles said with a proud smile. It's the result of maintaining connection points that help anchor social stability. Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Holyrood House, they're not just symbols of royal authority. They're working components in a system that helps maintain the psychological health of the nation. William was quiet for a long moment, absorbing information that challenged everything he had understood about his future role. Finally, he spoke with the gravity of someone who was beginning to understand the true weight of the crown. Father, if these traditions are so important, why the secrecy? Why not let the people understand what they're receiving? Charles had anticipated this question, but hearing it from his son gave it special poignancy. Because understanding comes gradually, and because the effects depend partly on the traditions being maintained consistently rather than being subject to political debate. Imagine if every election included referendums on whether to continue ceremonies that most people couldn't understand. He walked back to the throne and sat down, the ring of binding seeming to grow heavier with each step. But, you're right to question the secrecy. Tonight's discussions with the other European monarchs have convinced me that we need to begin a gradual revelation. The world is changing too quickly for the old approaches to remain viable. Lady Margaret approached with another message, this one marked with the highest security classifications. Your Majesty, unusual activity from our monitoring stations. The artificial intelligence systems that have been tracking historical patterns, they're beginning to generate predictive models that approach the accuracy of the covenant itself. Charles felt a chill as he read the classified report. Advanced AI systems were analyzing vast databases of historical information, correlating events with factors that traditional historians had ignored or couldn't access. They were beginning to identify patterns that suggested the existence of hidden influences on European political development. How long before they deduced the existence of the covenant? Charles asked. The analysts estimate 18 to 36 months, Lady Margaret replied. Potentially less if the AI systems begin sharing information more efficiently. William looked alarmed. You're saying that computer systems might expose these traditions before we decide how to reveal them ourselves? Exactly, Charles said. Which is why tonight's ceremony is so crucial. We're not just maintaining ancient traditions, we're preparing for their transformation into something that can survive in an age of radical transparency. He stood and walked to the window again, looking out at London in the early hours of the new year. The monarchy has survived for 1,000 years because it has adapted while preserving what was essential. Tonight, we begin the next phase of that evolution. Catherine had been quiet during much of the discussion, but now she spoke with a clarity that impressed everyone in the room. Your Majesty, if I understand correctly, we're facing a choice between controlled revelation and forced exposure. But there's a third option, transformation, that makes revelation irrelevant. Charles turned to look at his daughter-in-law with new appreciation. Explain. Instead of revealing ancient secrets, we could demonstrate their modern relevance. Show people that monarchy provides benefits they can't get from purely democratic institutions, without necessarily explaining all the mechanisms. Let the traditions evolve into forms that work openly in the digital age. Dr. Blackwood nodded slowly, her expression showing growing excitement. The Princess of Wales makes an excellent point. Many of the Covenant's purposes could be achieved through transparent programs in mental health, community development, and cultural preservation. The secret ceremonies could become public festivals that provide the same psychological benefits while building national unity instead of maintaining aristocratic mystery. William was following the logic with growing enthusiasm. We could position the monarchy as the guardian of Britain's deeper cultural traditions, the institution that maintains connections to wisdom that transcends political cycles. That's a role people could understand and support without needing to know about thousand-year-old documents. Charles felt something shift in his understanding, as if the ring of binding was conveying approval from his predecessors. The solution they were proposing honored both the substance of the ancient traditions and the requirements of the modern world. Then, that becomes our path forward, Charles announced. We begin planning a gradual transformation that will take years to complete, but that starts tonight. He removed the ring of binding from his finger and held it out toward William. The covenant allows for shared sovereignty in times of transition. If you're prepared to accept the responsibilities, we can begin your true education tonight. William stepped forward, understanding that he was about to cross a threshold that would change not just his own life, but the future of the British monarchy. As the ring slid onto his finger, the transformation of royal tradition from ancient secret to modern wisdom officially began. The ceremony was far from over, but already the future looked different than anyone in the throne room could have imagined just hours before. As the ring of binding settled onto William's finger, the transformation was immediate and profound. The young prince's expression shifted from curiosity to something approaching wonder as he felt the connection to centuries of royal consciousness that the ring provided. Through its influence, he could sense the presence of his grandmother Elizabeth II, his grandfather George VI, and monarchs stretching back through generations of British history. I can feel them, William whispered, his voice filled with awe. Not just memories, it's as if they're here in the room with us. Charles nodded, remembering his own first experience with the ring decades earlier. The accumulated wisdom of the crown, he explained. Every decision, every crisis, every moment of triumph and failure, it's all connected through the ring. This is how monarchs have guided Britain through challenges that should have destroyed lesser nations. Catherine watched her husband with growing amazement as his understanding expanded. Through the ring's influence, William was processing information that would have taken years to communicate through normal means. He was experiencing firsthand the weight of responsibility that came with true royal authority, but also the profound satisfaction of being connected to something larger than any individual life. The Commonwealth, William said suddenly, his new insight revealing connections he had never seen before. The way former colonies chose to remain connected to Britain after independence, it wasn't just sentiment or political calculation. They were responding to something deeper. Exactly, Dr. Blackwood confirmed. The Covenant's influence extends throughout the former empire. The traditions we maintain here create a psychological anchor point that helps stabilize democratic institutions across multiple continents. It's why Commonwealth nations consistently rank higher in global surveys of life satisfaction and governmental effectiveness. Lady Margaret approached with another update, this one showing global monitoring data that was only accessible to the highest levels of royal security. Your Majesty, the international effects are beginning to manifest. Commonwealth Prime Ministers report improved clarity in their New Year strategic planning sessions. Former colonial territories show measurable decreases in social unrest indicators. Charles felt a deep satisfaction as he watched his son absorb these revelations. The monarchy he would pass on to William would be fundamentally different from the one he had inherited, but it would be stronger and more relevant to the modern world. The next phase, Charles announced, requires us to begin selective revelation. We start with the Prime Minister. This statement sent a shock through the room. In nearly 1,000 years, no British Prime Minister had been fully briefed on the Covenant's existence. They had operated under its influence without knowing it, making decisions that aligned with ancient wisdom while believing they were following purely rational political calculation. Father, William said, the ring's influence helping him understand the implications immediately. Rishi Sunak has been asking questions about the unusual coordination between different government departments during crisis response. His background in finance has made him sensitive to patterns that don't follow normal institutional logic. Which makes him the ideal choice for our first full revelation, Charles replied. He has the analytical background to understand the data, and his relative newcomer status in politics means he hasn't developed fixed assumptions about how government really works. Dr. Blackwood was already preparing secure communications to arrange the unprecedented briefing. I recommend we include the Cabinet Secretary and the head of the civil service, she suggested. The administrative mechanisms for gradual revelation will require their cooperation. As the early morning hours advanced, Charles outlined his vision for the monarchy's transformation over the coming decades. The secret ceremonies would gradually evolve into public festivals that honored Britain's deeper cultural traditions. The hidden obligations would become transparent programs in international cooperation and cultural preservation. The ancient wisdom would find expression through modern institutions that people could understand and support. The key, Charles explained, is to maintain the substance while changing the form. The psychological and spiritual benefits that our traditions provide are real and measurable. But they don't require secrecy to be effective, they require authenticity and consistency. Catherine had been taking notes throughout the night's revelations, her journalistic training helping her process the information systematically. Your Majesty, what about the other royal families? If we transform our approach, how does that affect the European network? We coordinate the transformation, Charles replied. Tonight's discussions have convinced me that all the constitutional monarchies are facing similar challenges. We evolve together, sharing our experiences and supporting each other through the transition. William was studying the ancient maps again, but now his understanding was enhanced by the ring's influence. The energy patterns that connect these sites, modern science might be able to amplify their effects rather than just preserve them. We could use technology to strengthen the psychological anchors rather than replacing them. This insight excited Dr. Blackwood enormously. Prince William, that's precisely what our research has been suggesting. Quantum field generators positioned at the traditional sites could enhance the natural effects while making them more consistent and reliable. We could actually improve on the ancient methods while honoring their original purposes. Charles felt a surge of pride as he watched his son and daughter-in-law embrace roles they were just beginning to understand. The monarchy was indeed entering a new phase, one that would combine ancient wisdom with modern innovation in ways that neither tradition nor technology could achieve alone. There's one final element, Charles said, walking back to the silver box. Inside, beneath where the parchment and vial had been stored, was a hidden compartment that even Lady Margaret had never seen opened. Charles removed a small device that looked like a simple compass but was actually something far more sophisticated. This instrument has been used by British monarchs for 3 centuries to monitor what we call the national resonance, the collective psychological state of the British people. Tonight, its readings have been unlike anything recorded in modern times. He showed the device to William and Catherine. The needle was pointing steadily upward, indicating levels of social harmony and collective purpose that hadn't been seen since the end of World War II. The people are ready for deeper connection, Charles observed. The rise of mental health awareness, the growing interest in mindfulness and spirituality, the search for meaning beyond material success, these trends suggest that Britain is prepared for traditions that acknowledge the spiritual dimensions of national life. William nodded, his understanding enhanced by the ring's influence. We're not abandoning the ancient ways or forcing modern changes. We're facilitating a natural evolution that serves both the traditions and the people. As dawn approached London, Charles made the final preparations for a day that would begin the transformation of the British monarchy. Secure messages went out to prime ministers and presidents across the Commonwealth, alerting them to expect significant policy announcements in the coming months. Similar communications reached the other European monarchies, coordinating their mutual evolution. Lady Margaret began drafting briefing documents for government officials who would need to understand their new responsibilities. Dr. Blackwood started planning research programs that would study the effects of the ceremonial network using modern scientific methods. Catherine outlined communication strategies for gradually introducing the public to concepts they had never imagined their monarchy encompassed. But William remained focused on the most important task of all, learning to bear the weight of responsibility that came with the ring of binding while planning how to pass that responsibility to his own children in ways that would serve a world neither he nor Charles could fully imagine. "Father," William said as the first light of dawn began to enter the throne room through the ancient windows, "what we're beginning tonight, it changes everything, doesn't it?" Charles smiled, feeling more optimistic about the monarchy's future than he had since his coronation. "Yes, it changes everything. But it also preserves everything that matters. That's what successful evolution requires, knowing what to adapt and what to protect." As Big Ben chimed 6 o'clock on New Year's morning, Charles and William stood together in the throne room, two kings sharing power in a way that had never been attempted in British history. The ring passed between them throughout the ceremony's final phases, each monarch contributing his own wisdom and perspective to decisions that would shape Britain for decades to come. The ancient traditions continued, but they were no longer secret. The royal obligations endured, but they would soon be transparent. The monarchy's connection to Britain's deeper spiritual and cultural foundations remained strong, but it would serve an informed and participating people rather than an unknowing one. As the ceremony concluded and the silver box was sealed for another year, Charles felt the profound satisfaction that came with successfully stewarding the crown through a crucial transition. The monarchy William would inherit would be both ancient and modern, both traditional and innovative, both British and universal in its appeal. The future remained uncertain, but, for the first time in decades, Charles was confident that the British monarchy would not just survive the challenges ahead, it would thrive by becoming something unprecedented in royal history, an institution that combined the wisdom of ages with the transparency of democracy, serving both the ancient needs of human nature and the modern requirements of an informed society. The ring of binding had done its work once again, guiding the crown through transformation while preserving its essential purpose. As Charles removed it from his finger for the final time that night and placed it back in the silver box, he knew that when it emerged again, it would serve a monarchy unlike any that had existed before. The hidden traditions would remain traditions, but they would no longer be hidden. The royal wisdom would continue to guide Britain, but it would do so with the understanding and support of the people it served. The ancient covenant between crown and nation would evolve into something that honored both its historical origins and its democratic future. In the end, that was perhaps the most royal tradition of all, the ability to adapt and endure, to change profoundly while remaining essentially the same, to serve each generation according to its needs while preserving the accumulated wisdom of all the generations that had come before.